My name is Jamie Sullivan, and I am the manager for the Safety Center. Just going to go through these poll questions that we had you guys fill out. It looks like we have about 40% of you joining us from the West today. We have about 30% from the Midwest, 10% from Northeast, about 6% from the Southeast, and about 13% from other. And it looks like the great majority of you are joining us by computer only today, so welcome. We do have a few of you on the phone as well. I just want to remind everyone, if you do by any chance have any issues with the audio for today's webinar, it may be due to internet signal, so we would have you join us by phone if you do have those issues. The phone number can be found in the top left-hand top left-hand corner of your screen. And if you do have any audio or visual issues, you're also welcome to chat with the hosts up in the top, and Dana will be happy to try and help you with any issues you may have. It looks like we have great representation today from across the different agencies. We have about 25% of you from state DOTs, about 22% from local DOTs, about 4% from federal. We have about 4% of you joining us from public lands agencies, about 6% from universities, 28% from private consultants, and then we have a few others in there as well. And it does look like most of you, about 80%, are joining us on your own, but as always, we do have a few of you joining us in groups and conference rooms. And as always, we would ask those of you in groups, if you could please send a detailed list of names and emails to info@ruralsafetycenter.org. We will then send out the surveys to everyone on that list, and that is the only way that you can request your certificates of completion and CEUs for today's webinar. So I'm going to get us moved over to the presentation now. Okay, just a few additional logistics for you. Today's webinar is an hour and a half long. It is being recorded and it will be available on our website in about a week. For quality of the recording, as always, we have muted everyone's phone lines other than the presenters. If you are listening on the phone, we would ask you to please mute your computer speakers, otherwise you will hear feedback. There will be a few pictures and graphics in today's presentation. If you'd like to see those in a bigger view, you can use the 4 arrow keys in the top right-hand corner of your screen that point outward. That will get rid of all of the extraneous information from Adobe around the bottom and left-hand side and make just the PowerPoint itself bigger so that you'll be able to see it more easily. At the end of each of our sections today, there will be time for question and answers. There will be 4 question and answer periods in today's presentation. By no means do you have to hold your questions until we get there, though. We're going to be using the chat pod on the left-hand side because, as I mentioned before, you are muted. So at any time, you can put your question in that chat pod, and when we do stop for question and answers, I will read those aloud to our speakers. There is also a handout pod on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen that has in it a PDF version of today's webinar for you, as well as a resource that one of our speakers would like you to have available to you. And he'll speak about that more when he's presenting. Again, I'll mention if you are joining us in a group today, don't forget to send those lists to info@ruralsafetycenter.org. And we would ask that you please complete our follow-up surveys. We will have 2, as always, that come out. The first survey will be directly following today's webinar and sent to all registrants. It may end up in your junk mail, so we have provided the survey link for you on the screen right now, as well as in the PDF version in the handouts. This survey link is the only way that you can request your certificate and CEUs. The survey will close 2 weeks after today's webinar, and that is when we will start creating the certificates and CEUs. So you should expect to receive them about 3 to 4 weeks after the webinar is completed. The CEU forms, if you do want to request those, need to be returned to continuinged@montana.edu and not to the Safety Center, as that is handled through a different department at Montana State University. And I'm going to show you on this next slide. The top left is what the course registration form will look like that we'll email out to you guys, and you can fill that in and return it to Montana State. If you do want verification that you have received CEUs for any of our trainings, you can request that from the same department, and they will send you something that looks like the form in the bottom right-hand corner. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit more about today's presenters. First, we will have Brooke Struve, who is a Senior Safety and Geometric Design Engineer at FHWA Resource Center. She provides technical assistance and training nationwide on design flexibility, performance-based design decision-making, and designing for the safety of pedestrians and bicyclists. Prior to joining the Resource Center, she was on the pre-construction team in FHWA's Office of Infrastructure. There she worked to advance best practices in the design discipline across the agency and provide technical support for interstate access, geometric design, and accessible design for disabled pedestrians. She has worked as project manager for FHWA's Eastern Federal Lands Highway Division and as a team leader for the Utah DOT, leading the development and design of projects ranging from low-volume recreational roads to urban arterials and freeways. Brooke has a BS in Civil Engineering from Brigham Young University and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Utah. Up second, we will have Michael Williams, who is principal of Michael Williams Company, a transportation consulting firm specializing in active transportation, roundabouts, road diets, rural environments, and traffic calming strategies. Michael has been involved both in the planning and design of active transportation facilities for more than 15 years. In addition to 15 years as a licensed public works general contractor, he holds 3 engineering degrees and has been awarded more than 10 patents. Michael is a member of AP, BP, and ITE. Michael advocates for, researches, and presents on ABLs in an effort to increase awareness and adoption of this new roadway type. And he will be speaking a little bit more about a website that he also has that will give you more information on these advisory bike lanes. So once you have completed this webinar, you will have an overview of why bicycle travel should be included in the Rural Transportation Network, gain an understanding of key safety principles for bicyclists, and learn about design treatments, countermeasures, and the latest guidance. Our learning outcomes for today are to identify safety risks to bicyclists, to compare different needs and desires of bicyclists, to describe countermeasures for safe bicycle travel in rural locations, to describe the operation, benefits, and challenges of an advisory bike lane, and to summarize the characteristics of a road which may be suitable for conversion to an ABL. And at this point in time, I would like to pass it along to Brooke Struve to get started with our first part. Brooke?
Thank you, Jamie. And Dana, will you please elevate me to presenter again? Thank you. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and a couple of outcomes we're hoping to achieve with this conversation is to help you identify some of the principal safety risks to bicyclists, compare the different needs and desires of different types of bicyclists who might be in your community, as well as describe some countermeasures for safe bicycle travel in your rural location. Now, in the short time we have, we'll only be touching on a few of those, but hopefully you'll also sign in for the future webinar that's going to be on the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide, as well as looking for opportunities. We have some workshops and things that we provide on bicyclist safety, and there are opportunities there. If you're interested, you can reach out to your local Federal Highway Administration office to see what those opportunities might be. Why is bicyclist safety important? Well, in 2015, we had 818 documented bicyclist fatalities, and we estimate that there were 45,000 injured. Those numbers we suspect are underreported. Very often, certain types of crashes aren't recorded in our fatality data, and often people don't report their injury type crashes. Cyclist travel counted for 2.3% of all traffic fatalities, which is a fairly low percentage overall. And when you think about the thousands and thousands of people who die on our highways every day, 814 is a relatively small number, but those are each individuals, and the impact of those deaths are felt by their families and friends and communities. And when we think about the proportion of bicycle trips as compared to the number of trips we take on our highways, the number of people on bikes are certainly overrepresented in these numbers. And when you think about the number of miles traveled, very often bicycle trips are much shorter than motor vehicle trips, and when you think about proportion of miles traveled, bicycle travel is a very much smaller proportion, but still overrepresented in the injury and crashes. So what are some of our opportunities? 50% of trips in the U.S. are less than 3 miles in length. More than 1/3 of U.S. adults say they would commute by bicycle if safe facilities were available. And 1 out of every 11 U.S. households do not own an automobile. Now, certainly these numbers are encompassing all environments, urban and rural. The character of this data would change relative to an urban setting, but it is informative. What are some of the characteristics of bicyclists? Well, an experienced and confident bicyclist will navigate on the street. They may prefer to have a bike lane, shoulders, and shared use paths if they're available, but sometimes even when they're available, those confident riders will stay in the street because perhaps there's a lot of traffic on the shared use path that they have to navigate around, the strollers and the dog walkers and so forth. Or maybe there's a lot of cross streets that they have to cross on the shared use path, whereas in the motor vehicle lane they can continue on their journey without stopping. They generally prefer the direct route. They'll ride at speeds of up to 25 miles per hour on a level roadway, and they may even get as high as 45 miles per hour on a downgrade. And they will generally take longer trips. Now, on the other hand, the casual and less confident rider may have difficulty gauging traffic or be unfamiliar with the rules of the road. They'll prefer a shared use path or bike lanes being on a low volume street. They prefer more separation from traffic. They may ride on the sidewalk, which in some circumstances can be more dangerous than riding in the street because motorists aren't expecting someone riding at bicyclist speed on the sidewalk, and particularly if the bicyclist is coming from a direction they're not expecting them. They're at risk of being hit. They will generally avoid traffic. They'll ride at speeds of 8 to 12 miles per hour, and they'll take trips of 1 to 5 miles in length typically. And this is another key thing to remember when we're thinking about our rural environment. You may not be able to get from your rural community into the next urban center by bike as a casual rider, but you might be able to navigate around your town and do a lot of travel by bike. This number may also change when you're thinking about an area where you have public lands or tourist destinations where families are there on a vacation and they want to enjoy the natural environment, and they may get out on bikes and they might take longer trips to get to those recreational destinations. I like to refer to this study that was done in the city of Portland because it's informative about the types of bicyclists and the choices that they may make. First, we have the strong and fearless bicyclists, and they found that in their community, that made up about 1% of the overall population. And then you have about 6% who would describe themselves as enthusiastic and confident. And then we have 60% who are interested but concerned. So I would suggest we can make some correlations here. Maybe about 1 to 7% are already using the roadways to bike. Or maybe that enthusiastic and confident, they're being cautious and selective about which roadways that they're choosing to bike on. The interested but concerned, if they're bike riding, they're probably using a shared use path or not biking at all. And then finally we have the not interested, no way, no how. And that's how they describe themselves. And that made up 33% of the population. But I would suggest that perhaps if some of those individuals could see safe, comfortable facilities available to them to get to where they wanted to go, they might even change their minds. And so we have a huge unmet opportunity here for people who might choose to bike if they felt comfortable. So let's discuss a little bit the comfort for bicyclists, because in reality, well, perception is reality. If you don't feel safe, you're not going to choose that mode of travel. So there's this model called the levels of traffic stress, where you can characterize different bikeways by the level of stress or discomfort that a bicyclist feels. And a level of traffic stress 1 is suitable for almost everyone, including children. Level of traffic stress 2 is suitable for most adult bicyclists. Level of traffic stress 3, you're starting to filter out that 60% of the population who is interested but concerned. And level of traffic stress 4, you're probably only seeing that 1% of the population using those corridors, if at all. So here we can see some characteristics of those type of facilities. A level of traffic stress 1 may be separated physically from the roadway, have very low volumes, or if the bicyclist is mixing with traffic, the speeds are very low at 25 miles per hour or less. Bike lanes are wider, intersections are easy to navigate, and this is going to be comfortable for children. Level traffic stress 2, the bike lanes might be a little narrower, the speed's a little higher, the intersections may be a little bigger, and this is comfortable for most adults, and this is very typical of the examples that we see from the Netherlands, where biking is truly a comparable mode with motor vehicle travel. Level traffic stress 3, the speeds are up at 35 miles per hour, or you might be mixing with traffic at 30 miles per hour. This is comfortable for most current U.S. riders. So that's 7% perhaps of the population who's probably riding on the street will use these level of traffic stress 3 facilities. And it's typical of a lot of the bike lanes that we've typically installed across the U.S. And finally, level of traffic stress 4, you might have no bicycle facilities, high traffic speeds, 40 miles per hour or more. So keep in mind that what we've typically been doing in the U.S. that's comfortable for the current riding population is level of traffic stress 3. What's comfortable for most adults is going to be something that provides a little more space, a little lower speeds, and a little more separation from traffic. So is this relevant in a rural context, you might be asking yourselves. And so as an example, I'd like to refer to my own community here in Strasburg, Colorado. And here we have an aerial photo of the rural core of our community. We have a post office and a health clinic, a few restaurants, a hardware store, a convenience store, and some gas stations. We also have a school. So these are some of the features. We also have a state highway that also functions as our main thoroughfare through town, as well as some other state highways that intersect. The length of the town as you're driving through on the major state highway is about half a mile. Now let's zoom out a little bit. And if I draw a circle around that rural core of Strasburg, about 1 mile in diameter, you can see that that encompasses most of that rural core. Someone could very easily, in a few minutes, ride from one end of the town to the other, a very rideable distance for that casual, less confident bike rider. And if I draw another circle around the community, 5 miles in length, or diameter, you can see that we've encompassed not just the town, but the isolated farmhouses, as well as some of the isolated developments around the community. This is also a very bikeable distance for that casual, less confident rider. And so those neighborhoods, those individual farmhouses, they could use a bike to get into town, to get to those destinations, if they felt comfortable doing so. And let's just zoom out a little bit more. In the center, we have our community of Strasburg. And just a bit to the east, we have another neighboring community of Byers. This is where our nearest grocery store is. There's also another school. And so if I wanted to take a bike ride to the nearest library, it would be about a 6-mile ride, not an unreasonable distance, particularly where I have a specific destination in mind. A little bit to the west, we have the town of Bennett, and there we have a community center and a larger grocery store, a UPS office, and another high school and another library. And a bike ride there would be about 9 miles in length. There again, with specific destinations in mind, with employment centers and services, this would be a very bikeable distance for someone who needs to reach those destinations. So when I look at that community, if I'm thinking about that casual, less confident rider, I'd be thinking about some very comfortable on-street facilities around the urban core of Strasburg. And I'd also think about having some separated bikeways that would provide links between these communities. Now, if you go much further beyond this snapshot that you're seeing, the distances are much longer. You're going to be seeing probably only the strong and fearless or enthusiastic and confident bike riders traveling much beyond those communities. And so in that case, I would be thinking about different treatments that might enhance their safety on the existing roadway facilities that we have because they're already comfortable using those facilities. And here I have a snapshot of some young men in my community who are on a bike trip. They're riding home from church. They happen to choose to ride on this residential street instead of the state highway that runs parallel to it, which is a great choice. However, there are some disconnects between their origin and their destination, where they are going to have to get on a busier state highway where there's no shoulders, no facilities of any kind. That because those segments are short and it's in the the rural core of the community, they're feeling confident to do that. However, I would suspect their parents would not allow them to take the trip that goes from Strasburg to the neighboring towns because those state highways on which they'd have to travel are much faster, have higher volumes of traffic, and have no shoulders available to them. Next, we're going to talk about some of the countermeasures that we might consider for bicycle travel in rural locations. And first off, I'd like to mention some key safety factors for bicyclists. Very often we're making judgment calls. We're trying to think about who it is in our community who's traveling, where they might be wanting to go, and what the most appropriate design treatment would be for them. So some of those factors are speed. We know that as speeds go up, vulnerable users of our roadways are at much greater risk. At 20 miles per hour, a pedestrian has a 9 in 10 chance of survival if they are hit by a car. But at 40 miles an hour, that statistic reverses, where they only have a 1 in 10 chance of survival. And certainly at higher speeds, reaction times are shorter. It takes more distance for vehicles to stop. Number of lanes means that intersections are more difficult to cross and are more confusing for bicyclists. Visibility, I'm referring to the motorist being able to see the bicyclist being able to see the motorist, and the conflict points they may encounter being very conspicuous so that they're aware of where there's concern. Traffic volume and composition refers to the types of cars, how many of them there are, and if there are a lot of large trucks and large vehicles using the corridor. And it also concerns the number of bicyclists who might be using the corridor. You know, if bicyclists on the roadway might be causing operational issues by backing up traffic if there's no passing opportunities. The conflict points are those intersections or driveway locations or other locations where the motorist and the bicyclist have to cross paths of travel. and trying to make those as clear and conspicuous as possible. Proximity is how close you are to those large vehicles. I had the experience not too long ago of riding on a residential street, and being polite, I moved over for the vehicle I could hear approaching behind me, and it was a garbage truck, and it passed me within about 2 feet, and I had visions of falling over and ending up under the tires of that large vehicle. It was a very uncomfortable circumstance, and we want to not terrify our bicyclists when they're using the roadway. Bike control refers both to the geometry of the roadway, but also the condition that of the road on which the bicyclist is traveling. Very often, debris might accumulate on our bikeways and gravel, and these are things that can make it difficult for bicyclist travel. And then there's other things to consider, like where are utility cuts made in the pavement, or are there potholes? Because something that a car might easily traverse will throw a bicyclist off of their bike. And finally, and perhaps the most important, connectivity of our bike network. So often in the best attempts to get something in that might be comfortable for bicyclists to travel, we don't think about where the connections are or how to make those transitions, and the bicyclist might be riding along happily and then fall off the end of the earth essentially because the bikeway ends and they're not sure where to go. Thinking about where the origins and destinations are, can we connect them up and provide that comfortable network? And until we have that network in place, thinking about how to communicate a transition that will help bicyclists get to where they need to go. So these factors are things that we should be considering as we decide what application to use when we want to enhance bicyclist safety. I'd like to point you to a publication that FHWA released back in December of 2016. It's a fantastic resource for rural communities. It provides a bridge between the existing guidance we have for bikeways that is very often focused on the urban environment and links that to what would be appropriate for rural practice. We want to encourage small towns and communities in the rural area to use the innovations that are available and adapt those to their setting. And this publication provides examples from similar communities to yours to give some insights on how to treat bicyclists. Some of the great features in this guide are these application guides. For each bikeway described in the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Network Guide, there are suggestions on the appropriate speed and volume for the bikeway. For example, these relate to bike boulevards, where traffic volumes up to maybe 15,000 vehicles per day and speeds up to 20 miles per hour. This might be a great treatment. It also describes where on your network this might be appropriate treatment. You probably wouldn't use this on the state highway, but many of your parallel corridors would be suitable locations. And then finally, what sort of land use? I probably wouldn't use the bike boulevard to connect up the town of Strasburg with buyers, but I would use it within either of those towns to help someone navigate across town. And when we're thinking about the different types of bikeways that we might consider, we want to think about whether we're in a town area with short distances to many destinations, where traffic speeds are slower and volumes are probably lower. Some of those treatments we might use would be a yield roadway, a bike boulevard, or advisory bike lanes, or as they're called in the guide, they're referred to as advisory shoulders. And those Michael will be talking about shortly. If we're designing for the casual, less confident rider on that higher speed, higher volume state highway or county road, we'll want to be considering things like shared use paths, separated or buffered bike lanes, or enhanced shoulders. Now, when we get beyond the area where we're likely to have the casual and less confident rider, then we have some different considerations for the experienced, strong, and fearless bike rider. Some things we would consider would be traffic volume and traffic speed. If there's a high volume roadway and a lot of bicycle usage, it just makes sense to make sure there's some shoulder space or bike lane space so that they're not trying to compete for the same roadway. If there's a steep grade, the bicyclist won't be able to travel at speeds approaching those of a motor vehicle. And so there again, giving them a climbing lane essentially, or giving them space outside of the motor vehicle travel lane can be helpful, or making sure that there's some other passing opportunity. And then also sight distance. If you're traveling among the cornfields of the eastern plains of Colorado, you might have a long distance to see the bicyclists as you're approaching from behind and overtaking them in your motor vehicle. But if you're on a very curvy mountainous road, you might not have a lot of time to observe that there's a bicyclist ahead of you. And so maybe using that as an opportunity to provide some warning signs to motorists so that they can be more aware that they may encounter bicyclists ahead. And then finally, those conflict points would be another thing to consider, maybe enhancing the visibility and conspicuity of the bicyclist. I'd like to point you to a website, and it is provided in the references. The link for that is provided in the references towards the end of my presentation. But this captures all of the experimental and interim approval traffic control devices that aren't in the current edition of the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. So I want you to use the opportunity to try something new. We simply ask that you reach out to your local FHWA division office to go through a simple process to use these experimental devices. Or think about, is there something new that would fit your community well that may not be in the current manual? There might be an opportunity for you to invent the next great solution for bikeway safety or other safety features. On this website, you can click on a link that describes the traffic control device in detail and also lists other locations that are using it. So this is a very useful website. I refer to it frequently, and I would encourage you to put it in your favorites. It also has some great information on interpretations for things already in the MUTCD related to bikeway traffic control devices. I'm going to talk about some bikeway traffic control devices and other treatments, just touching on a few concepts that I'd like to share with you today. First of all, shared lane markings. Some things that, if you're going to use shared lane markings, letting the bicyclist travel in the lane, or rather emphasizing that the bicyclist may use the travel lane, these can be very helpful, particularly on lower speed roads. The current guidance in the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials guidance for planning and design of bike facilities has some suggestions about the placement of sharrows, but I would argue that sharrows or shared lane markings are best placed in the center of the lane. If you truly have enough space for a motorist to pass the bicyclist, if the bicyclist is riding closer to the edge, then you have enough space to actually mark a bike lane. Otherwise, the motorist should be changing lanes to pass. Or you end up in that situation where I was in, where the garbage truck was passing me within 2 feet of clearance. The other reason we want to be cautious about the placement of sharrows is the proximity to any parked cars that might be there. Or, as in my town where we have angled parking, you don't want the bicyclist to be too close to a car that might be pulling out of one of those parking spaces. So by placing the sharrow in the middle of the lane, it gets them away from that risk. And then finally, I think it puts them in the most visible location, where the motorist is focusing their attention, where they're not disguised by anything like trees or street furniture that might be on the roadside. These can be useful on low-speed roadways, but you might also use these in those situations where you have some discontinuous links in your bikeway network and you want to provide some wayfinding for the bicyclist to help them navigate through. And also, if you have some intersections where bicyclists might have a choice of more than one lane if they want to make a left turn or a right turn or take the through movement. You might be using sharrows on more than one lane at your intersection. So situations where you might consider the use of shared lanes, if you have multiple lanes, so you have passing opportunities, or if it's a downhill section of your roadway or level where bicyclists can travel at or near the speeds of motor vehicles. If it's a short segment to fill a gap in your bikeway network, if speeds are low, and if you have a high interest in bicycle use on the corridor. Locations where you would probably avoid using sharrows is if you've got a single lane, there's few passing opportunities. If it's an uphill roadway where the motorist would be backed up behind a pedalist who is struggling to get up the hill. If you have another route that's parallel and nearby, that would be a preferable option. If it's a really long segment where traffic might back up behind it, or if the speeds are high, or if it's just not a corridor where there's much demand for bicycle travel, then you probably wouldn't consider installing sharrows. Let's talk a little bit about share the road signs. We have seen a lot of variations across the country. Here we have one where we've depicted the motorist and the bicyclist riding side by side, which might imply the bicyclist is supposed to move over, the motorist is going to pass them beside them in the lane, which could be uncomfortable. Then we have this image, and given the space of the sign, it does portray that they're both perhaps in the center of the lane, but it looks a little aggressive, like the bicyclist is being tailgated by the motor vehicle. So maybe that isn't really conveying the message we want. And then we have a sign here where we've got a regulatory message on a warning type sign. I don't know that anyone would know how to enforce or deal with this, perhaps. And then we have this yin and yang symbol where we're telling people share the road, we all belong. But if you think about it, yin and yang actually means forces in opposition, which might be truer than we'd like to admit. But ultimately, who shares the road? When you ask, or if you observe your average 2-year-old and they walk up to a parent and say, Mommy, Mommy, I want to share, usually that means the 2-year-old wants what you have. And the share the road sign historically was developed with large, slow-moving farm-type vehicles in mind. And while it was a great attempt to apply it to the biking environment, it hasn't really been as well understood by the public as we would hope. So rather than using a share the road sign, what we recommend is using a warning sign with a bike symbol. You can use a supplemental placard along with it to say bikes on roadway. Or you can use a regulatory sign that says bikes may use full lane. Now, I wouldn't recommend going out and taking down all your share the road signs immediately. That's an expense that might be too much. But consider as you're replacing the signs, as the reflectivity is diminished or as they get hit over time, that you replace them with one of these other sign options. Now, next I want to talk about passing signs. Many states have adopted a passing distance, a minimum passing distance for motorists. And there have been a lot of signs that have been developed to try to communicate to that to the public. But overall, traffic control devices aren't meant to be educational signs. And so instead, we would recommend using the use full lane or bikes use full lane sign with a supplemental placard, both in the regulatory color, that says change lanes to pass. So the motorist knows they're meant to do a proper passing maneuver, not try to squeeze past the bicyclist in the lane. Now, you wouldn't use this everywhere, but you would perhaps use it in areas where you already see a concern or you have an identified problem. This is some guidance that comes from the Small Towns and Rural Multimodal Network Guide, talking about different types of shoulder applications that you might use on your bikeway network. Now, depending on the functional classification and volume, speed of your roadway, you might use some different pavement markings. You might also use some wider widths on those busier corridors to make that bikeway more suitable, more comfortable for bicyclists. I'd also like to mention, because you can see in the image the rumble strip, we certainly want to provide opportunities for bicyclists to enter and leave the bikeway, whether to avoid that piece of a tire that's in their bike lane or the gravel or the pothole, but also to make those turning maneuvers. And so there are recommendations on providing gaps in those rumble strips so the bicyclists can enter and leave the bikeway, but motorists still get the safety and benefit of having a rumble strip. And something else I would also suggest you keep in mind, if it's on a section of a bikeway where it's a downhill for a long distance, where the bicyclist could be traveling at higher speeds, you might want to extend the lengths of those gaps so that the bicyclist can actually maneuver at a higher speed between the gaps in the rumble strip. Intersections and turning conflicts are a great risk to bicyclists. Bicyclists experience all the conflict points at intersections that motorists and pedestrians have. In addition to that, they have two others. They have the through right turn conflict, where the bicyclist is traveling through the intersection and the motorist is making a right turn. And bicyclists also have a conflict where they might need to navigate across traffic, weaving to the left side of the roadway to make a left turn maneuver. And there's a number of the treatments that have experimental or interim approval that might be applied in your rural core. As you get out beyond the rural core, you might simply do some things with your pavement markings, using some dashed lines to highlight the conflict point, maybe using a turning vehicles yield to bikes sign to remind motorists to watch for those bicyclists. There's a lot of treatments we can use to make shared use paths crossings much more conspicuous to motorists and give bicyclists and pedestrians safe opportunities to cross the roadway. We can use advanced yield warning signs. We can use advanced yield and stop lines. And the benefit of that is if you have multiple lanes of traffic approaching the bike or approaching the crossing, if one motorist stops, the sight lines are not obscured by that stopped car for the bicyclist to see the other lane of traffic and see if another car is approaching. We can also use a raised island. There's a safety benefit for having a raised island in the center of the roadway as pedestrians and bikes are crossing. It also provides some cues to the motorist that there is a crossing at this location. Or you can even provide a raised crossing entirely where it almost creates a speed hump for motor vehicle travel. And then finally, we can use flashing lights on our warning signs, like a rectangular rapid flashing beacon that is actuated with the push of a button. So when a bicyclist or pedestrian is present, they can push that button and get motorists to have better yielding behaviors. And finally, we could use the pedestrian hybrid beacon, where a signal actually comes on which tells motorists they have to stop and give the pedestrians and bicyclists an opportunity to cross. I also want to talk about the typical way we mark shoulders in the rural environment. You might have intersections that look very much like this, where maybe you have some shoulder on the roadway, but as you get to the intersection, the radius of those pavement markings sort of sucks into the edge of the pavement, and that opportunity to use the shoulder just disappears. We can make some simple changes that are essentially no cost in how we mark shoulders at such a location. I'd like you to consider this. If you look at the bottom half of the roadway, you can see that the shoulder line stops and then jumps over to an edge line that goes around the radius. And then we have a dashed line that continues up to the stop bar. And then on the other side of the road, we have that edge line again going around the corner, but we have a dashed line that connects up to the shoulder line where the shoulder continues on. Or we could even extend that dashed line through the intersection like you see on the top side of the intersection. These would be some simple changes that if you have bicyclists using the corridor would make them more visible and more conspicuous at that intersection. If you're in more of your rural core downtown center, you might use some of the green pavement markings or other treatments to even make them more conspicuous. And finally, I just want to ask you, what does it mean to be safe? Certainly we talk about fatalities and injuries quite often. You know, we want to be alive, we want to be whole when we make our journeys, but ultimately we want to be comfortable. Our knuckles shouldn't have to be pulled away from our bike handles when we get done with our trip, or our fingers peeled back from the steering wheel. We shouldn't have heart rates that are up for any other reason than we've just had some good exercise. We want to be able to enjoy going about our business and navigating our communities. We also want to think about who is using our bikeways. You know, children, our friends and neighbors. It's not just the spandex warriors who we see making those long distance trips. When I think about my community in Strasbourg, I see a lot of opportunities where we can communicate the transition from the rural highway to the main street, where we can encourage slower traffic speeds, where we can provide space and communicate that bicyclists do belong in those corridors, and communicate to motorists that they should expect them. So I encourage you to take the opportunity to look around your community, see where the opportunities are, see where those network connections are, and see if there's something that you can do to enhance bicycle safety. And here I have some resources for you in the presentation. One of them is a link to the website I mentioned. We also have a link that talks about FHWA's encouragement for communities to be flexible in their design practices and use all the resources that are available to you. And then we also have a link for the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks, or actually that's for the webinar that's coming up, but the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks guide is available online. I would encourage you to download it, print it off, share it with your friends and neighbors.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brooke. So I do want to point out that Small Town and Rural Networks Guide is available at that link that Brooke just did put up, and that webinar was held last February, so the archived version of that is available for you to watch recorded at that website as well. If any of you need CEUs or certificates of completion for that, at that web link there is also a link to take our survey and request that after the fact as well. So Brooke, we do have a few questions coming in for you. I am going to read out to everybody our next poll question, and then we'll go ahead with some of those questions for Brooke. So, let's see, sorry, I pulled up the wrong one. Only those traffic control devices that are in current manual of uniform traffic control devices can be used for bikeways. True or false? And prior to today, had you ever heard of advisory bike lanes? The second one will help our next presenter know how many of you have heard of them before. So Brooke, our first question for you is whether or not you could talk a little bit more about the process related to the Dare to Experiment slide that you talked about.
Well, what we like to do with the, particularly with the experimental devices and the interim approvals, we ask that a community get some before and after data, measuring, you know, what kind of behavior is happening, or measuring what type of crash patterns you're having before and after. And the purpose of that is so that as other communities try these devices out, that we will get a body of knowledge nationwide, and hopefully that will support their use in the next edition of the MUTCD. It's not meant to be onerous. Certainly, it may be a little bit more complicated with an experimental device. The interim approvals, it's pretty simple. Mostly we just want some simple before and after information, and as well as just knowing the locations where these are being installed. We have people in our Office of Operations that can help with that process. Your local division office can help with that. And it may be that your state DOT is the agency that you need to talk to about that. So talk to your state DOT traffic office, and they might be able to direct you to your local process for doing that.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Brooke. And for those of you who are wondering about that link again, it is in the chat pod. Michael, thank you for posting that while Brooke was speaking. It is also available as the bottom link on the resources slide that Brooke posted too. And again, you can download the handout, which will include all of those links from the bottom left-hand corner of your screen right now. And when we do post the archived version of this webinar, the handouts will also be available there as well. Brooke, the next question for you is, I have yet to meet a cyclist that knows that a sharrow's position indicates where they should ride in the lane. Should there be signage to reinforce the desired position?
I don't know that signage is the appropriate approach. There again, we don't want to clutter our roadways with a bunch of educational things. Hopefully it's something that maybe through NHTSA we can start communicating that better. But I understand that the research that we have has also indicated the same thing, that bicyclists don't necessarily position themselves with the sharrows, and that might be something that will take some educational efforts. And certainly if you're placing them for the first time in your community, that would be a great message to get out to your schools and the bike riders in your community.
Another question for you is, how does the reality of the growing community of electric bicycles fit present policy or planning? For instance, the maximum speeds easily are 20 to 25 miles per hour on a flat terrain.
I don't know that we have any national policy related to electric bikes as of yet. There's a lot of communities that are grappling with this and taking different approaches. In some cases, they're trying to implement ordinances where you can only use electric bikes that travel at slower speeds in your bike lanes. And that may or may not be used to some effect. I think it's something that we're going to have to watch and develop some approaches to, because they are becoming more popular, that as well as the electric scooters that we're seeing a lot of. And there again, if they're traveling at speeds comparable to what the bicyclists travel, I think that their usage in bikeways can be compatible. I'm more concerned when they try to use sidewalks, because they're not very compatible with pedestrian travel. But thinking about that differential in speed would be my greatest concern, and how they're interacting with people that have to use their own pedal power or their own foot power to travel.
We have two more questions for you, and then we'll move on with our presentation. But the next one is on the bikes may use the full lane or change lanes to pass signs. The question is, are there any states that require motorists to change lanes to pass? The MUTCD only permits regulatory signs if they are supposed to by state law.
I am not sure on the answer to that question. I know that I've seen some signs in California where they actually cite their code reference on the sign, and I've seen some related to that in California where they've cited that. That gets into a regular question that I'm not as familiar with. However, that would be a great opportunity. And certainly a lot of the motor vehicle codes treat bicyclists as a motor vehicle when they're on the roadway. And why would they be any different than another motorist? And why would you not change lanes to pass another vehicle that's traveling in the lane, as opposed to squeezing past them side by side?
And your last question before we go to the polls is, I'm going to change it slightly to what does FHWA recommend as opposed to the Safety Center for rumble strip implementation that is safe for bicyclists on rural roads and highways between towns, given that most of these roads provide 0 to 4 feet of shoulder space, not the 5 to 8 feet that's recommended.
Well, in that case, if you're going to use shoulders as a bikeway, you have to think about widening the shoulder sufficient so that you are providing space for the bicyclist. And the other thing you consider is sometimes we can use some unconventional treatments to create a shared use path off the roadway that would be less expensive. There's a lot of people that maybe in an urban environment that wouldn't be willing to ride on a compacted dirt or gravel type roadway, but in a rural environment that would be expected or not unusual for bicycles to travel on, and it could be a much lower cost solution. However, you do need to think about grading them occasionally after the winter months so that they're in good condition and repair. But if you are thinking about shoulders as your bikeway, then you need to think about a little bit more width provided for bicyclists.
And Brooke, I have now closed the polls and broadcast those results, so you should be able to see the results for the first poll on the left-hand side. If you would go ahead and talk everyone through the answer for that one, please.
Okay, it looks like most of you have the right answer. Certainly, the easy answer is to always turn to the MUTCD and find traffic control devices, but some of the most innovative and best solutions for bicycle travel are not in the current MUTCD. We're still trying to catch up. And so that's where you want to look to some of those innovative solutions, look at some of the recommended guidance documents that show some different ideas that you won't see in the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices.
Perfect, thank you. And again, if anyone has any additional questions for Brooke, we will take those at the end after Michael has finished his presentation. So thank you, Brooke. And as far as Michael, it looks like about 51% have heard of advisory bike lanes before today. So you have about half of our audience who has heard of them before. I'm going to move you back over to the presentation. Okay, and Michael, you're all set.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Brooke. Well, got about half and half split here, people who have heard of advisory bike lanes before. So I'm honored to introduce you to this new idea. We're going to start by, Jamie there we go. We're going to start by taking a look at some of the problems we face in the rural environment when trying to retrofit bike and pedestrian facilities to our existing roads. If we take a look at the substrate available to us, paved rural roads, about 84% of the paved rural roads in the U.S., about 1.4 million miles, are classified as either local or collector roads. And these are the type of roads that most of us use every day to visit friends, visit families, our workplaces, schools, markets, etc. And because of their low volumes, these roads can be good candidates for on-street bicycle and pedestrian facilities. But multiplying even a conservative percentage of that road mileage by the cost to add bike lanes and or sidewalks produces numbers which imply billions of dollars in decades of work. Additionally, many of these roads are too narrow to easily add standard bike lanes or sidewalks. But a new type of roadway known as an advisory bike lane, or ABL, can help address these cost and width issues, as well as provide another tool to communities wanting to add non-motorized facilities. So what is an advisory bike lane? Well, it is not a non-motorized facility that's simply added to an existing road. It's a unique type of lower speed, lower volume roadway, which is new to North America. And what does it look like? Well, it looks much like this slide here, with the exception of the motor vehicle symbol in the middle. You have one center lane for motor vehicles traveling in both directions, and edge lanes on either side preferentially reserved for non-motorized users and supporting one-way travel only. The edge lanes are separated from the center lane by broken lines, and there is no center line. If you have a road with a center line, that's a completely different animal and outside of the scope of this discussion. Pavement markings consist of bike lane markings in the edge lane and the broken lines separating the lanes. The car symbol in this illustration is not included. And what about the terminology around ABLs? Well, they're most commonly known as advisory bike lanes, The FHWA calls them advisory shoulders. And really neither of those terms are good ones because they tend to imply that you're just adding these lanes to an existing road, and that really isn't true. And the edge lanes truly are not bike lanes, and neither are they shoulders for the MUTCD. Edge lane is the term I prefer for the two lanes on the outside edge. Many people call them bike lanes. I still do at times, but they can support other types of non-motorized users. So how does this thing work? Well, when alone, a motorist stays in the center lane, as shown in the top left here, mimicking the operation of a one-way street with bike lanes. When drivers encounter approaching traffic, they must merge into the edge lane after yielding to anybody there in order to pass. And after completing the pass, motorists return to the center lane. And I mentioned that this is a new roadway type in North America. Currently, we have about 19 full advisory bike lanes in North America and 5 what I call pseudo ABLs. And so this is a new thing. And whenever you run up against a new thing, you have to make a decision. Is this worth my time? So what benefit does an ABL provide? What makes it worth your time? Well, number one, probably the biggest benefit is that an ABL allows you to add facilities for non-motorized users on roads that are either too narrow for standard treatment or unlikely to receive funding for substantial improvements in the near future. And the sweet spot for the width of this thing, for the width of available asphalt, is in the 20 to 32 foot range. It can go wider. Any narrower than that, you start running into issues. One of the big unsung qualities of advisory bike lanes, in my opinion, is that it moves us from the traditional win-lose game into a win-win game. With most other treatments, any inch you take away from motorized facilities in order to create non-motorized facilities, well, I just described the win-lose game. It's a struggle, right? You have to find that room somewhere, and it either comes from the motorized or you got to do something with your right-of-way. But advisory bike lanes allow you to make those edge lanes wider without taking away roadway width from your existing motorized facilities. ABLs can provide a traffic calming effect. If designed appropriately with narrow center lanes, they can drop the vehicular speed that you see. This effect varies and looks like it tends to be facility specific. ABLs aren't cheap. They primarily consist of striping, so that's relatively cheap to begin with. And if you're doing a resurfacing project, you've got to put stripes back down anyway. You're talking about, getting close to free in terms of a public works project. ABLs can also extend the life of your road, reduce maintenance costs. By keeping vehicles away from that sensitive asphalt edge, you reduce degradation out there, and by varying the route vehicles take while traveling down the road, you avoid rutting issues. Easy sweeping snow removal. This tends to be more of an issue in rural environments than urban, but once you're done sweeping or plowing your roadway, well, you've already hit your non-motorized facilities as well. ABLs are safe and effective. We have 6 engineering studies done in the U.S. and published studies from other countries showing safe operation. And ABLs support all types of non-motorized users, wheelchair users, skateboarders, rollerbladers. ABLs can even address a little-known problem in the Mennonite and Amish areas where they have problems with their horse-drawn buggies getting rear-ended by vehicles. An ABL with a sufficiently wide edge lane would likely solve that problem. Horse-drawn buggies are approximately 6 feet in width, actually, for a little-known fact. But of course, ABLs have their own challenges. Here are the major ones. First is they appear simple, but they're really not. They have unique design needs, and that is not wholly appreciated in many cases. Some aspects of an ABL, such as the status of the edge lanes, can be considered legally ambiguous. A discussion of this issue using Oregon state law as a basis is available on a website I'll mention later. One of the most significant challenges to ABLs is the fact that few people know about them, and even fewer trust them. As with roundabouts in the 1990s, knowledge and acceptance are the large obstacles which must be overcome before we can see more widespread use. And ADA guidance is lacking. If the edge lanes are intended to be used as a pedestrian facility, then those edge lanes must meet ADA guidance. But there are issues there that aren't adequately addressed by existing ADA guidance. Lane width and the ambiguous zone. ABLs can provide wide bike lanes, edge lanes, but often do not. People are accustomed to doing the 5-foot bike lane, and they do that on an ABL despite the ability to do something wider and more comfortable. And the center lane width is an issue where certain widths can promote poor passing decisions by motorists, and that's an issue that needs a little more research. We have little domestic experience with this new roadway type. We only have a few installations and only a little time with those. The small town guide is our first piece of official guidance, and that's only about 1.5 years old at this point. We need to learn more about issues not currently addressed in that guidance and the nuances of those which are. And Jamie, do you want to do the question here?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to move us over to our next set of poll questions. Okay, and we have, which of the following are benefits of an advisory bike lane? Are they traffic calming, they're inexpensive, provides protection from non-motorized users, all of the above, none of the above, or I don't know, I don't remember? And the second one is, which of the following are challenges of advisory bike lanes? Legal ambiguity, little experience, appear simple but is not, all of the above, none of the above, I don't know, and I don't remember. And you can select all of the ones you believe are true. While we are waiting for the answers to that, I'm going to go back to the chat pod. And we had one more question for Brooke up here, and it was, can you use the W11-15 sign with the Share the Road sign?
I'm not that quick to know what the W11-15 is off the top of my head.
Brooke?
Yeah?
That's the sign that shows a pedestrian symbol or a bicycle symbol.
Oh, okay. Well, what I would suggest, if you have like pedestrians and bicyclists, there's the warning sign that shows the bicyclist on top and the pedestrian below. I suppose the reasoning behind that sign is if we have the pedestrian on top and the bike below, you might think that the bicyclist is flying off their bike. So the standard sign for warning of peds and bikes has the bike above, the ped below, and then you could put the supplemental placard on roadway. I wouldn't use the Share the Road message just because of what our experience has been with people thinking that someone else has to share or not understanding who's responsible for sharing.
Thank you. And then for Harry, who asked the question earlier about the change lane sign, We did get a comment in here that Delaware does have a change lanes to pass law. So if you have any additional questions about that, Harry, if you want to put those in the chat pod, and I can perhaps forward them by email to Delaware, get you guys in touch. The next question, Michael, I believe that is for you, is what is the volume range that this type of application recommended?
I see the two questions here, and I can address those in the second part of my presentation.
Okay, perfect. Then at this time, I'm going to end these polls and broadcast the results so that you can talk everyone through the answers for these as well. There you are. You should be able to see them now.
Thank you. Yeah, the first question, which of the following are benefits of advisory bike lanes? Quite a few people said all of the above. This is a bit of a trick question that I put in here. It doesn't really, ABLs really don't provide protection for non-motorized users. And this hinges on what you define protection as. But in this case, you've got simply paint on the road, and you are asking both parties, both types of users to share the roadway. So that's not generally considered protection, though it is visual separation, I guess is what I would call it. Certainly does provide traffic calming if designed appropriately. Certainly is expensive. The other question, which of the following are challenges of advisory bike lanes? Pretty much everybody got that one. So we'll just move on here. Do I need to advance to my slides, Jamie? Here we go.
You should be all set.
All right. Here we are into the second part of my presentation. Advisory bike lanes are often considered as that treatment one could use on streets which are too narrow for standard bicycle lanes. While that's certainly one of their strengths, ABLs should truly be considered as one of your tools in your toolbox for slow street treatment. If you think about it, ABLs are really kind of a codification, or they provide enhanced guidance to produce behaviors we expect to see on facilities like yield streets and bicycle boulevards. And when you compare these four treatments, let me get to the next slide here. I took the trouble of applying the level of traffic stress ranking system to compare bike lanes, yield streets or shared streets, bicycle boulevards, and advisory bike lanes. And what you see, now you got to take this with a bit of a grain of salt. Level of traffic stress isn't generally used to compare facilities directly like this. And they tend to, or LTS assumes that you either are mixed traffic only or completely visually separated, as in a bike lane. Advisory bike lanes fall kind of in the middle of that spectrum. So you have to make some assumptions. But what I generally found when I did this was that everybody down below 25 mile an hour or below that, everybody's at LTS 1, all ages and abilities. But as you increase the speed, the yield street and the bicycle boulevards, their stress levels tend to go up rather quickly. Advisory bike lanes keep their low stress levels longer. And bike lanes, of course, because of their absolute visual separation, they keep their low traffic stress scores a bit longer than the ABL does. So let's talk a little bit about guidance, or references in this case. FHWA Small Town Guide, which Brooke mentioned, that's our first and only official guidance at this point on advisory bike lanes, or advisory shoulders as they're called there. You got the 2016 Crow Manual, which is a Dutch bicycle design guide, and it does an excellent job capturing their 50 years of experience with this roadway type. You have to kind of read it through a few times to drag everything out, but it's an excellent resource. AdvisoryBikeLanes.com is a website. Two goals really with that website. One was to be the most complete online source of information on ABLs, and the second was an attempt to incorporate the lessons learned by more experienced countries who have been using these things for 40, 50 years into our current official guidance. Next, a white paper I co-authored while working with Alta, Advisory Bike Lanes in North America. This is really kind of the start of a native body of literature native to North America on advisory bike lanes. And then if you're interested in conversing with other folks, we have a listserv dedicated to advisory bike lanes, and there is your URL if you're interested in joining. So let's talk about specific guidance. The small town guide, as Brooke mentioned, we have these great graphics. Their guidance on advisory bike lanes is that they prefer them to be used at 25 mile an hour and below, 3,000 ADT and below. And in that range, you have a lot of installations worldwide that support that type of use. It goes further to say, well, you got potential applications as well, where you can go up to as fast as 35 miles an hour and 6,000 vehicles per day. There is much less experience with that range. So you're entering into waters that are less tested, probably need more engineering judgment there. As I mentioned before, I believe the sweet spot, 20 to 32 foot wide is the width of pavement you need to do well with this type of facility. The pavement markings, also mentioned this before, standard bike lane markings in the edge lane if you're using it for bicycle. Signage, you got the R317 and the W63, which are commonly used. And as Brooke referenced earlier, this is considered an experimental treatment by the FHWA. All the components of an advisory bike lane exist in the MUTCD, but their combination as a roadway type is considered an experimental treatment, and the FHWA requires people to go through the RTE process. So I've got 3 case studies. I picked 3 existing North American installations, which are about as rural as I could come up with. It's interesting, despite the fact that advisory bike lanes are in this rural small town guide, most of the existing installations are in an urban environment. So our first case study is Burlington, Vermont, and they had a street which accessed a large regional park. It was on the shore of a lake there, and also a bike path that went around the lake. And they had a bike lane that came close to the park, but they had the short connector that did not have bike facilities and was clogged with on-street parking. And so they had a lot of issues with safety and getting cyclists there comfortably. So what they did, excuse me, what they did is they moved all the parking into the park and placed an advisory bike lane on the street. If you notice in the right-hand side there, you see some big tanks. That's an oil distributorship. So they had a fair amount of heavy vehicle use on this road, tankers going up and down. So that was a factor that caused them to create a wide center lane. But in this case, they hit what I call the ambiguous zone. and it prompted some complaints or concerns from cyclists about people passing each other near cyclists in the edge lane, and that wasn't as comfortable as it could be. But it did the job. Bloomington, Indiana, a big college town, and in this case, it was a student-dominated neighborhood, and they had just completed a connection, I believe, to the college that went under an existing interstate freeway, and they needed to connect to that underpass. And they weren't able to widen their road. The interesting thing about this experience is that they did almost no public outreach whatsoever. They waited till the students went home for the summer. They came out, striped the road, and when the students came back, they got very, very little reaction. This is unusual. Most communities do a lot of public education, a lot of public outreach. It's such a new facility. People get confused. People get concerned. In this case, there was none at all, and it worked marvelously. Next case study, Hanover, New Hampshire. They had a road that didn't have sidewalks, didn't have bike lanes, went through a single-family residential area, large lot, but they had a significant problem with speeding down the road, and they also had a not insignificant amount of bicycle and pedestrian traffic on the road. They went ahead and put an advisory bike lane, and I don't have a slide showing the results, but they saw a decrease in speeding problems, they saw a decrease in automobile traffic, and they saw increases in both bicycle and pedestrian volume. So a real success story in Hanover. And to finish, I just want to leave you with 3 key points. Advisory bike lanes can provide facilities for non-motorized users on narrow roads with that 20 to 32-foot sweet spot. They're very cheap to install. They can extend your road life, saving money, and they move you out of that win-lose paradigm and into a win-win paradigm. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. And we do have another set of poll questions for everyone, and then I'll read Michael out the questions. So the first one is, what are the recommended preferred and maximum volumes for ABL? And you can see the list there. And then the next one is, what are the recommended preferred and maximum speeds for ABLs? And while you guys are answering those, Michael, the first question for you was, you don't see head-to-head vehicles for ABL on winding, hilly, high-speed rural roads as a potential safety issue?
I'm sorry, I did not address that issue in my presentation, though I said I was going to. So what that question is getting at is sight distance. And the current recommendation for sight distance in the small town guide is to use passing sight distance. And that's a very conservative number. I'm working with Dr. Peter Firth on creating a sight distance which is specific to advisory bike lanes. Passing sight distance has a lot of assumptions to it that aren't appropriate for an advisory bike lane. The passing sight distance model assumes that both vehicles are 19 feet long. I think the speed difference they assume is 10 miles an hour, 12 miles an hour. I forget now. Passing sight distance also assumes that the passing vehicle is sitting behind the vehicle to be passed and then accelerates and moves out to pass. So there are a number of assumptions that aren't appropriate for the operation of an ABL, but the good news is that all of the misassumptions fall on the conservative side. So passing sight distance works fine. So yes, there are sight distance issues with advisory bike lanes. If you use passing sight distance, you're more than covered.
Thank you. The next question for you is, if the roadway is two-way and has considerable large truck usage, semi-trucks, what type of edge lanes and center lane widths should be used?
That is a very good question. And that's a question that we really need more research to answer. My personal response is that it's heavily context dependent. Often heavy vehicle use occurs at times other than heavy passenger vehicle use. You need more information to really do a good job addressing that kind of issue.
The next question for you says that this viewer found the Pro manual difficult to access, the previous version of it, and wanted to know if you had recommendations on how to access that information.
Well, I'm not sure what the difficulty in accessing consists of. If you want to get the Chrome manual, it costs a fair amount of money to buy it. There is a new version, a new translation out of the new version, the 2016 version. There might even be a small excerpt of it on advisorybikelanes.com. That might be useful. I'm not sure how to address the access difficulty. It is expensive to buy.
The next question for you is, are ABLs suitable for more serpentine rolling hill type roads?
And that's getting back to the sight distance issue, which I talked about. It's essentially a sight distance. When you have a sight distance issue, your first step should be, can we remove the obstacle that creates the sight distance problem? When you come to topography, that often gets to be pretty expensive. The second step is, well, can we reduce speed to make the sight distance problem go away? With either traffic calming, signage works to an extent, and then if neither of those strategies are really feasible, then you have to convert from an ABL back to a normal road with a center line. Maybe you go with shared lane markings. Maybe you have enough space, or you can create enough space to add true bike lanes to the road at that point. But you can transition to another type of facility if you can't remove the obstruction.
Thank you. Michael, at this time I'm going to ask you to go ahead and address the two poll questions, and I have broadcast the results for those.
All right, what are the recommended preferred maximum volumes for ABLs? Well, about half the people got it right. 3,000 is the preferred level, or 3,000 and below is the preferred level. 6,000 ADT is the ceiling, and that's driven by an MUTCD requirement that any roads of 6,000 ADT or above must have a center line. And the second poll question were the recommended preferred and maximum speed. Most people got that right. 25 mile an hour and below for the preferred realm, and 35 mile an hour and below for the potential realm.
Perfect, thank you. I am going to move us back to our presentation and finish up today's presentation, but Michael, there are 3 questions remaining in the chat pod. If you wouldn't mind taking a look at those 3 bottom questions and seeing if you can answer them through the chat pod itself, I would appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you. So for today's webinar, what we hope that you guys have learned is to identify the safety risks to bicyclists, to compare different needs and desires of bicyclists, to describe countermeasures for safe bicycle travel in rural locations, to describe the operation, benefits, and challenges of an advisory bike lane, and to summarize the characteristics of a road which may be suitable for conversion to an advisory bike lane. So that you're all aware, our next webinar will be September 25th, called Utilizing ITS for Rural Road Safety. We are planning also webinars on rural aging road users and another one on the Everyday Counts 5 innovation that just came out on reducing rural run off the road departures, and those will all be announced. Some of them may be held before this September 25th webinar, but we will send out announcements for all of those, and you can always check our website as well on the registration page. As always, we do archive all of these webinars and post them to our website as well. I do want to let you know that the Everyday Counts Innovations is having a few upcoming webinars through FHWA, which may be of interest to our rural listeners on the phone. So reducing rural roadway departures, there will be a webinar on September 12th from 11 to 12:30 Eastern and September 13th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And then a safe transportation for every pedestrian webinar on September 24th and another one on September 25th, both at 1 p.m. Eastern. The link for how to register for those is at the bottom of the screen. Again, all of these links are available on that handout in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. I also want to mention one more time that we are having the National Summit on Rural Road Safety in December in Savannah, Georgia. We are expecting the registration and the agenda to be posted next week on our website, so please keep an eye out for that as well. And if you have any other questions for our speakers today, I have their emails listed on the screen. I am going to put up one more poll question while Michael is finishing answering up those chat pods. And this one is, in the Safety Center's final months, what additional rural and safety-related webinar topics do you feel would be most beneficial for your organization? You can type anything into that chat pod right now as we close out the webinar. We'll keep the recording going for a few minutes to give you some time to put in those topics. One more time, I do want to thank Michael and Brooke for presenting today. I think we had a great conversation about bicyclists, so thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. At this time, that concludes our webinar. Have a great afternoon.